Welcome to the Peer Review Podcast, Cultivating Creativity and Fulfillment in Academia. I'm Sarah Bunin-Benor. In each episode, my co-host Mira Sukharov and I speak to fellow scholars, coaches, and other experts about finding meaning in academia. Today, I'll be interviewing Lila Corwin Berman. Lila Corwin Berman is the Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History at New York University, where she directs the Goldstein-Gorin Center for American Jewish History. Lila is the author of several award-winning books, including, most recently, The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, The History of a Multi-Billion-Dollar Institution. And she has another book coming out soon in the spring called Who is American? Belonging and the Question of Jewish Citizenship. She's also written many articles in scholarly journals, and she's also written public-facing articles in the Washington Post, the Chronicle of Higher Education, etc. Welcome to our podcast, Lila.
Thanks.
So let's start by you telling us briefly about your research.
Yeah, so actually that was a really exciting introduction because I think you're the first person who's introduced me and said what is now the title of the book. You know, book titles change over time. So I've heard myself say it, but no one else has said it. So I appreciate that. So I'm a historian of American Jews and US politics, political history. My research has tried to understand how Jewish politics are shaped by the United States and how American politics are shaped by Jews. So that's like the kind of big overview of what I do. And as you mentioned, one of the book titles about philanthropy. So I've studied economics and finance. I've studied urban politics and urban space and language and discourse, all toward the same ends of thinking about the kind of entangled politics of Jews in the United States.
That's a great elevator pitch. So where did you do your PhD and what field was it in?
I did my PhD at Yale, and I was in a religious studies department, and that department was broken up into many different tracks. Most of those tracks had very little to do with one another. So my track was American religious history, and most of my work happened in the history department.
Okay, and so even when you were doing your PhD, did you know that you wanted to study Jewish history?
Yes, yeah, that had been my intention coming in. But I also had a very strong sense that I wanted to study it in the context of American history, and that it was really important for me to think about the kind of broad questions from American history, the history of other religions in the United States. So that sort of explains, I think, how I kind of fit into Yale, although a lot of it was just happenstance.
Okay. And some people who are in an area field also have a discipline. And so it sounds like the discipline you were trained in is religious studies, but also history. So have you had jobs in both of those?
So I would say that part of graduate school was spent trying to figure out whether religious studies was a discipline. And we had a lot of conversations as graduate students about whether those of us in religious studies had anything to do with one another. Someone studying patristics, did they have anything to do with what I was doing? And I think the conversation has changed. And so people doing religious studies now would give different answers. So I never felt as if religious studies was my discipline. History, I feel, is my method and discipline. I have always appointments in history departments, often with, though not always with, religious studies like courtesy appointment. In the position at NYU, though, my position is just joint between history and Hebrew and Judaic studies, which is not usually a department, but at NYU it is.
Got it. Okay. So tell us what parts of your job you enjoy the most and find the most fulfilling.
It really varies over the course of a year. And I think that actually that is the answer, that the thing I find most exciting about my job is the variety of it. There are times when I'm really deep in research and I just, am getting so excited about different things that I can see in the archives, leads I can follow, like so exciting when you are looking at one set of papers and suddenly you see the name of a case or of a person or legislation that you've been following elsewhere. And it's like a puzzle. It's like being an investigator. I love that. Other times, if I sit down and have to read another PDF from another archive, sets of endless meeting notes from 1922, I feel like I'd rather poke out my eyes. Even though other days that was really exciting. And some of those days, instead, what's great about my job is writing. And I often think, like, when I was an undergraduate and trying to figure out what I might want to do with my life, well, first I thought I was going to be a lawyer, but in the back of my mind, also, I thought if there were a way to make a living doing it, I wanted to be a writer. Um, and probably a mix between some practical concerns and also limitations of my own ability. I was interested in fiction writing. Kind of steered me toward academia where I felt like I could get the pleasure of writing, but attached to some different ends. So there's other days when the writing is just being able to sit and, think about crafting sentences and paragraphs and communicating ideas like I love. And then being in the classroom with students, hearing their ideas, thinking about how to take ideas that I have been thinking about only in the confines of my own head and get students to grapple with them and think about it. That's really exciting. So it's like the variety, I think, speaks to my need to be thinking different ways and doing different things and not sort of just falling into a rut.
Yeah, that makes sense. What parts of your job do you find least enjoying and fulfilling?
Um, I don't think I come by patience naturally. I think that I have a streak in me that is not always interested in, like, lots of protocol, the kind of committee work of being an academic. Um, Trying to come to consensus. It's one thing that people have different perspectives, and that's interesting to me. But when it's sort of like we're just having a hard time figuring out how to efficiently achieve a task, I try not to express it, but I can feel pretty impatient sometimes about that kind of service work. Like, on the other hand, one of the wonderful things about being in the department is working with people and, the kind of scholarship that I do is pretty solitary. I have had some collaborative experiences. I'd be happy to talk about those, and they're very fulfilling. But I do crave human contact, and so I think that sometimes my impatience with committee work and administrative tasks is counterbalanced when I'm working with people who are just interesting, and it just means you get human connection in a job that doesn't always have that, lots of that. So I guess I sort of silver lined what I don't like.
Which is an important thing to do. You didn't mention in your favorite and least favorite parts of your job, public engagement. Do you see that as part of your job or separate?
I don't see it as they would say in employment law, an essential function of my job. I think that people can be incredibly good and significant scholars without doing public engagement. I find it something that I sometimes feel like called to do, like that I feel like I have something I want to share with a broader public, that I want to intervene in a conversation that sometimes feels really, really important to me. And I think that specifically in Jewish studies, there has historically been a community of people who are interested in the work that we're doing, not just for scholarly reasons, but for reasons having to do with their own identity. And so I recognize that there are people who are eager to be learning about the kind of work that we do.
So tell us about some of the public engagement work you've done.
So I've done public writing, which in a certain sense is the most satisfying public engagement because I really, really enjoy writing and I like thinking about writing in different registers. So there's like one way you might write for a conference paper or for a workshop for colleagues, and there's a very different way you might write for a newspaper or for, some other kind of venue. So I think the experience of producing that kind of public engagement is excellent. I love the deep editing that that kind of work can get, which when one writes a book, um, probably depending on how you do it, sometimes you can get that kind of deep editing. I haven't had that much of that really deep editing, so I just love that. I learn a lot from it. But the downside, I think, of that kind of public writing is either you feel like you're screaming into the void because there's so much out there. So you write something and you get it placed, and then it's like you don't hear much. You don't know, did it do what you wanted, which is to intervene in a conversation? And it can get a lot of engagement, and some of that can be really hateful. And you kind of put yourself out there in a way and expose yourself, and that can be hard. The other main kind of public engagement I've done is speaking. Um, and I do get a kind of charge. Like I think I like being not just in conversation with people. I think I like being in front of an audience and trying to think about, like, how do you make ideas come alive? How do you keep people engaged? Um, Probably like a little bit of performance, right? So I've done speaking at synagogues, I've done speaking at cultural centers, at to, for example, like the Conference of American Reform Rabbis has a big convention that was a very big audience. And then I've done smaller kinds of courses. So, being brought in to be faculty for some adult education programs and things like that. So those kinds of opportunities can be neat ways to sort of play with new ideas and just see how they land and test different ways of explaining big concepts in more synoptic ways.
Yeah, same. I find a lot of meaning in those kinds of public engagement too. Can you give us an example of an article that you wrote that did cause a lot of controversy or negative feedback?
The work I've done that has received the most both criticism and then engagement more generally is my work on Jewish philanthropy. Part of it is because there's a sort of third rail quality to talking about Jews and money, and a sense that it can be like sort of poking the bear because there's so many anti-Semitic tropes about Jews' financial duplicity, and even just the language is very overdetermined, right? So this is an interesting example of an article that stirred controversy. I studied a lot about the history of a kind of obscure financial philanthropic vehicle called donor advised funds. And I learned about how their origin, which is really about tax code, was the genius in many ways of a Jewish tax lawyer who did a lot of work for the Jewish Federation of Cleveland. And I ended up writing, like, for this kind of law review type journal about this history, and then it in certain ways wove into my book. But somebody at the Jewish Daily Forward reached out to me because he had seen something I'd written about it and asked if there's a way I could sort of write a more popular piece about this, because donor advised funds are really, really important in terms of Jewish philanthropic life. And they're kind of something, if you have one, you know about them. But even if you have one, you might not understand sort of how it fits into larger, like really big questions about capitalism and democracy. So I said, sure, yeah, I'll write that. So I wrote this piece, and it focuses on this guy, Norman Sugarman, who was that kind of genius. He had worked for the IRS for a while. It's really, interesting mind. And I did not put the headline on the article, and it's not what I would have chosen. And it was something like the godfather of billions of philanthropic dollars is Jewish. That's not the exact thing, but it like used some combination of those words. And I felt a little uncomfortable with it, but it was, if you've written for the press, it's not only that you don't choose the headlines, you don't see them in advance. So it was what it was. And I got a flood of hate mail, especially from certain people involved in tax work in the world of Jewish philanthropy, who really felt like this was, I mean, and they directly said to me that this was anti-Semitic to even talk about this
Wow.
stuff. I understood why the headline could raise some hackles. The content bordered on boring, I thought, but it did indicate to me just how much this touched a nerve. But also, I think it made part of me feel like, yeah, I'm going to dig even deeper into this because, when we naturalize certain kinds of structures or ideas, I think that we actually lose a lot of how we can understand the world and how it works.
Wow. Okay, so much more we could talk about there. But let's go on to another question. Tell us how you organize your workday.
I love this question because my children will tell you I'm a obsessive reader in the Metro section in the New York Times on Sunday. They have a kind of day in the life of little column, right? It's like the second page in the Metro section. And it has somebody either who's sort of famous, and I think their PR agent got them to do it, or somebody who like is totally not. And it just goes through a sort of typical day. And I don't know why I love reading these because people are fascinating. Their
Yeah.
routines are fascinating. Okay, all that said, I don't think mine is very fascinating, but basically, I always exercise first thing in the morning. It's really, really important to me. I run, I do bar, I often walk the dog. So try to just move myself a lot in the morning. I do find that I am most productive with sort of creative work in the morning hours. So if I'm trying to write something, if I'm really trying to be very attentive to like, reading and synthesizing different ideas, I tend not to do work like prep for teaching or write talks for public audiences in the morning. I actually am pretty vigilant about protecting my mornings. So I rarely have meetings in the morning. If, you know, praise to the doodle that you can just say, nope, 9 to 12, I'm not meeting. So I really protect that time. It does sometimes mean it puts pressure on it. And if I'm like, why am I still reading the New York Times? Like I've told people I can't even meet and I'm just sitting here, perusing. So it doesn't always pan out that I'm so creatively diligent in the morning. But I find it really good time to get work done. And then like by noon or 12:30, I start to flag and I have lunch. And if this were the New York Times, I would tell you exactly what I eat for lunch, but I don't have to. And then like in the afternoon, I do try to do more of those other kinds of tasks. So if it's preparing for teaching, which actually I usually prepare for teaching like in transit on the train or whatever, it can be planning programs like for different roles I have at the university, doing committee work, reviewing an article, things like that that are like more discreet. If it's the summer, I stop no matter what by like 4 to go swimming every day. I'm addicted. If it's not the summer, I usually stop to walk the dog again and to do something active again. I used to work a lot in the evening when the kids were little. I have 2 kids. They're not little. And I used to go to bed by like 7:30 or so, and I'd do like another 2 hours of work at night. And then we'd watch a show or something. I pretty much don't work at night anymore. On the other hand, I work on the weekends often.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank
That's
you.
my work routine.
Yeah, I love that. Would you use any productivity tools?
Sheer anxiety. That's all.
That's a great tool. And what do you do to minimize anxiety?
Did you hear about all the walking and
Yeah,
running?
okay, so that works. That helps. That helps,
I
right?
also do always keep a little notebook next to me. And so, one thing that I find, maybe it's a low key use of the word intrusive thoughts, but like I'll be working and trying to write something and I'll get stuck or frustrated. And then my mind starts to loop and I'm like, oh, I needed to make this appointment. I needed to call the DMV, whatever it is. And like I will often think, oh, I should just do it now, especially if whatever I'm working on is not going the way I want it to go. But that can be like a whole derailment. And in my process of writing and everything like that, the struggle is part of it. So if I derail myself from the struggle, I think it's not good. So I have found that if I just write that down, make dermatologist appointment, whatever it might be, it's like I get to just like take the loop of that out of my mind. I don't think that's rocket science, but that's, one tool I kind of try to use.
No, that's great. And it helps you to keep focus or to get your focus back.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What challenges have you encountered in your career? You mentioned anxiety. What else?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, and to be respectful of people who I think really struggle with anxiety, I don't find myself like debilitatingly anxious about things about my career. And I think that part of that is I went into this feeling like there were a lot of other things I could do and wanted to do. So I never sort of felt like it was the only option. I suppose as one gets older, it becomes more of the only option. Um, but you know, I haven't felt like a great deal of pressure about the career, but I think in terms of obstacles or challenges, I mean, the whole validation of being in academia, it's hard to get away from just feeling like at each turn, like if an article's accepted, if a book does well, if a da da da, it's just always like, are you smart? Are you smart? And it's probably growing up a certain way and all sorts of things that we don't have to take on this podcast, but that sort of sense of like seeking validation for being smart, it becomes really tiresome and sort of awful, I think. And I don't like seeing the world through that prism. And yet it's very much lodged deeply within me. So I think that on like a meta level or something has probably been the biggest challenge to the profession. Like along the way, there have been all sorts of other challenges. And I think right now, the one that's foremost in mind is what it means to be working in the context of Jewish studies in higher education today. And to say I find it challenging is an understatement. I find it demoralizing, like absolutely demoralizing. And I feel as if I should be able to have something to say to intervene in what I see as a total abuse of both Jewish studies and Jewish people. And I feel kind of stuck and like I don't know how to solve it. And it makes me feel a certain kind of sense of not really wanting to be so kind of engaged with this particular field and feeling a certain like toxicity or something. So that's been a more recent challenge, I would say.
I think we need a little more information. What do you mean? What makes you demoralized, and where does that toxicity come from?
I think the toxicity currently is coming from the Trump administration, and the ways in which it's using anti-Semitism as a way to attack higher education, and the ways in which some of the settlements that schools are being pushed into accepting, or you could say they're capitulating, whatever the case is, um, seem to indicate that Jewish studies should be invested in as some kind of salve, as a way to remedy the problems on campuses. And it's just, to me, incredibly concerning to exceptionalize Jewish studies in that way, as if its purpose must be, and as if, in a sense, its success must be gauged by the criteria of whether or not it is combating anti-Semitism based on a tangled and, in my mind, really erroneous way of understanding anti-Semitism. So I find it hard to like get away from my concerns about that and what it's doing to the field of Jewish studies, what it's doing to universities, and what it's doing to our country.
Oh, wow. Well, how much of your research decisions are influenced by current events or things that you read about beyond academia?
I think that the things that interest me about the past are connected to things I'm concerned about and think about now. And, I think that like one of my central preoccupations has been questions of how people feel as if they belong, and the ways in which structures of power and politics um, define belonging. I think that's a very basic human question. And so, like, even just from that, it's not like drawn from the headlines exactly, but I think there's always a sort of correspondence to what my own preoccupations are.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned the idea of a concern about wanting to be seen as smart. Do you also feel a pressure to be productive?
I don't think I feel much of an external pressure to be productive. But yes, like I measure myself by productivity, I think, in almost everything I do. It doesn't occur to me from the outside because it's so ingrained in me from the inside.
So in what ways do you measure yourself by productivity?
I'm just constantly setting benchmarks for myself, like, absurd ones that then it's like, wait, why am I acting like this is due tomorrow when it's not? you know,
Like,
but
give us an
like,
example. Give us an example of that.
oh my God. So there must be a word. I'm not a procrastinator. I'm like the opposite of it, right? Like, so I get an assignment and it's very hard for me not to feel like, well, I should just do this tomorrow. And I really don't like having things hanging over me. And it's this fantasy that at some point I'll be done with everything, then I can relax, right? Sometimes I really will say, okay, as long as I finish this at the end of the day, like I'm going to go to the pool, I'm going to bring my novel, and I really am, I'll swim and then I'll relax. So I do relax plenty. But I kind of impose structures of like, I really need to get this done by this time. And part of it, I could change, and I have decided not to, because I do sometimes feel as if I have observed among friends and colleagues a pattern I wouldn't want to have, which is letting assignments, or deadlines or whatever, like letting things just bleed and take much, much longer than I think they should. So I've just sort of developed in my mind, like, okay, how long should a manuscript review take? How long should a tenure evaluation take? How long should writing an article take? And I think I'm very rigid about those things. And so that sometimes makes me feel like I'm in a race, but nobody actually set the finish line.
Oh my God, I feel exactly the same way. I never thought about it that way as the opposite of procrastination, but that's kind of what it is. Maybe we should call it pre-crastination.
Right.
No,
Yeah.
we gotta figure out a better word. But that I do think it's about anxiety. I mean, for me, like in my case, it's hanging over my head and it's making me anxious. And if I can just get it done, then that anxiety will go
Will
away.
go away. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that is absolutely part of it. Just clear the deck, like get this done. One of the problems with it is that it can lead you to not properly prioritizing things. So sometimes I'll realize like, oh, I spent this whole week on all of these little things because I felt like they were hanging over my head. And really like they're not due for a while. And I really should have prioritized something like reading a book, which has a very different, you're not like, check, I read the book, like it's more like it kind of has to take time to sort of seep into you and do what it might do with your ideas. So I recognize that there will be times when I will say, okay, like I'm going to put this on my list, and that means I'm freed from it hanging over me, because it wouldn't be a good thing for me to kind of like it's not an intentional prioritization. It sort of, prioritizes itself because it's like there and you have to do it.
Right. It's the urgent is the enemy of the important.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's interesting. The book, The Slow Professor, it argues against the emphasis on productivity and on getting things done quickly. It's influenced by the slow food movement. And like what you were saying before, you need to read a book, you need to let it seep in, and that's true for ideas. And we shouldn't be always trying to be so productive. But it sounds like that doesn't really align with your orientation, does it?
Well, I think I like classify different kinds of things, because I would say the process of writing books, and one reason that I enjoy it and find it sometimes torturous, is because it is slow. Like there's no like, to me anyway, the kinds of timelines of that quick dopamine hit, like I did it, it's done, cross it off. Like that's not what a book is. And a book just requires your mind to be working much more slowly, and to be, drawing ideas. Like suddenly you'll realize something from 10 years ago in a seminar is making its way into your head, and it's going to be actually the framework or the structure for how to talk about something. And it is something I find really satisfying, that there's a demanded slowness. I don't have the expectation that a book comes out in a year or something like that. It's like many years. And you have, like I have read so many books and articles for things I'm working on that they end up not being important. Like they don't make it onto even into a footnote, right? So I think that actually there is a part of that sort of slowness that's essential to what I do, and that I really, really appreciate. But I don't use it when I have other kinds of tasks. That's not my approach.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But also, you said that you don't get that dopamine hit for the book until the end. But I wonder, are there little mini dopamine hits in the middle? Like, oh, I finished the first draft of this section of this chapter.
No, there really aren't for me with books. The pleasure that like the episodic pleasure that I think I get from writing a book sometimes is a really good sentence, when like you really figure out how to say something, so that can be really pleasurable. It's definitely like research findings, like things that you're like, oh, fascinating. It's absolutely figuring out structure. Like I love thinking about structure, but I also find it torturous sometimes because it's like I think that the structure is the argument, is the everything, like knowing how to scaffold ideas. So there's lots of pleasure that comes along the way, but for me, any of those like smaller steps, like I don't feel the completion. I just know there's like more to come. And I don't know if it's an irony or it's just the reality is like even when the book is like done and you're holding it, there's something very anticlimactic, I think, about writing a book
Hmm.
for
Yeah,
me.
no, I totally get that. And then it might be years before it has the impact that you're expecting, or you might not even hear from readers for a while. Yeah,
Forever, yes.
forever. That's true. Okay, so tell us about the collaborations you mentioned before.
Yeah. So in addition to like workplace collaborations, like writing a report together, or putting together a proposal or whatever, I have done just a little bit of collaborative writing. And the most significant experience I've had with that is with two colleagues, Ronit Stahl, who's at Berkeley, and Kate Rosenblatt at Emory. And we just text a lot about things going on in the world and about the profession. And share articles. I think people call it like your private social media. So that's kind of what it is. And a handful of years ago, when Me Too allegations were coming out, and one came out about Stephen M. Cohen, who's a sociologist in Jewish studies, we started talking about how to think about the research that he had done and the allegations that were being waged against him and what the relationship might be. And we were like just sort of texting, and then we ended up kind of putting it on a Google Doc, and we started to write together, and we ended up writing a short piece that went in the foreword about the politics of Jewish continuity, much less so about Steve Cohen in particular. And then we were invited to expand the piece for a special issue of American Jewish History. And we physically got together in Philadelphia and we wrote. For a while, we were like at the Katz Center at Penn, and then we came back to my dining room. And it was so exciting to be writing with other people, like real time, and to be working on sentences. And then somebody would remember, oh, remember this article, right? Like my mind wasn't going there and they nailed it. Or even like, how should we start this sentence? And you had like two other just brilliant minds who were there doing it. Like, and then of course, sometimes it felt slow because I was like, I know where this paragraph's going, but we were hashing it out. And then actually it went somewhere different. And that's cool. So I just thought it was such a kind of release of power that is a little bit scary, but also felt exhilarating and fun, and like it was creating something that was really different from what I could have written by myself. I would like to figure out ways to do that more.
Would you ever consider collaborating with someone on a book?
Whew, I don't know. I think there's ways to do it where, people write different chapters of it, and I've collaborated with others as editors of books and things like that. But I don't know about a book. I think smaller pieces that have clear direction might be easier, but I
Yeah.
don't.
You mentioned before that you do reviews. Is that like reviewing an article that's been submitted to a journal?
Yeah, so reviewing articles or reviewing manuscripts that have been submitted to presses, reviewing
Hmm.
grant applications, and reviewing tenure files and promotion files.
Hmm. How do you decide if you want to say yes or no when someone asks you to do one of those?
I kind of have like a little mental checklist, I think. So probably one component of it is like selfishness. Is this an article I want to read? Right? Like, and sometimes something will come across and I'll be like, oh, I have to read this. Like, this sounds fascinating. And then, of course, like, I'll review the manuscript or the article or the book because, one writes book reviews too. So that's definitely one criterion. I guess another, obviously, is just like time. But the truth is, like, I feel like if I have the appetite, I always have the time. It's just I can think of a few times when like, a very big family event is happening or there's just an extraordinary circumstances when like literally I'm like, I just there's no way I could do this. But I feel like I shouldn't say this publicly because but, like, usually, I mean, like, a review doesn't take that long. A tenure review can take a long time. So, in terms of time, I would say it's not it's always kind of qualified by appetite, but also if I've just agreed to write a review or to do a tenure review or something like that, I won't agree to another one right
Mm,
away. And then there's sort of politics, I think, sometimes. So if it's reviewing a manuscript for a scholar who I feel like, their work really deserves to have somebody really making the case for it, and that for various reasons that might be really important, like I will try to step up in a way that I wouldn't if I felt like, oh well, 10 other people will be able to do this and it will all be the same, and whatever. So that sometimes factors in. Sometimes it's who's asking me. If I feel like they've done lots of things for me and I realize that it's hard to keep going to people to ask them to do things. So those are some of the considerations.
yeah. And I think I agree with that idea, that you find the time to do it if it's exciting to you,
Yeah.
um, even if it's really hard to find that time sometimes. So we're almost out of time, but I have one last question. What do you wish you had known when you started your career?
So much. um, I think that just knowing that it's okay that things take time and that, you don't always have to use every corner of time you have to shove in one more task. I mean, I'm never ever going to go anywhere without a book or without a task to do. That's just who I am. But um, I think about times like when my kids were little, when I was both playing with them and reading something or trying to grade a paper or whatever it might be that probably wasn't necessary. And, in the scheme of things, like being able to focus on playing with the kids was much, much more important than getting a task done. I think, just understanding that, yes, in a sense, time is kind of, a scarce resource. It is like we only have so much of it, but that therefore you should make really good choices about it. And I think it's just something I always will have to work on to just, be very intentional in the things that I want to be present in. And that is going to mean making choices sometimes and realizing that it's a choice.
Mm, that's beautiful. So it sounds like you're recommending more single tasking.
Yes, I guess so. Uh,
Well, yeah, go ahead.
no, yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And actually, we've had conversations about that outside of this podcast because I think anyway, and I think you too, like sort of pride myself on being a very good multitasker, but you told me that there's some research that actually there's kind of no such thing. And when I think about times I've been trying to do, multiple things at once, it's hard, it's not fulfilling. And ultimately, like we do all of this stuff, I think, for some sense of purpose. And it's hard to get purpose out of both cooking and trying to be reading this article and responding to emails and hearing about my kid's day or my spouse's day. So
Absolutely. And we can get that meaning and that pleasure from just cooking at that moment and then just talking to our spouse or our children in the next moment and then just doing our review for whatever we're working on, right?
yeah, actually, I have one other thing to add to what I wish I had known, which is I think I have always been hesitant to reach out to like older scholars or, you know, advisors or whatever. And if I'm in a pinch or just feeling confused about how to do something, sort of ask, like, I feel like part of this whole thing is you're supposed to be able to figure it out yourself. And it's like this very independent, individualized kind of thing. And as I'm at different stages in my career, like I love it when people reach out, not because I have the answers, like, but it makes me feel better because I see that other people have struggles and questions about this. It also makes me feel like I have something to contribute. And it makes me feel like we are part of a community. And I think that was something I didn't really appreciate, that actually like it wouldn't just be that I was taking up someone's time or that I was sort of asking for a crutch or some kind of special pleading, but that, that kind of conversation about like, yeah, how do we confront these challenges, or what do I do when I'm, at this roadblock with research or with whatever it might be.
Yeah, so much of academia is solitary, but we need so much interaction to make it worthwhile, meaningful, and even to improve the work that we do.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Lila, thank you so much for being completely focused on our conversation for the last however
You didn't
long.
know I was texting the whole time.
And thank you so much for all of your wisdom and for all the great work you do in the world.
Thank you. This has been fun.
The Peer Review podcast is produced and hosted by Sarah Bunin-Benor and Mira Sukharov. Talia Ehrenberg is assistant producer and editor. The music is written and performed by the Galactic Ambassadors. Support for this podcast comes from a faculty grant from Hebrew Union College. If you would like to sponsor an episode, you can reach us at peerreview@huc.edu. You can join the conversation on Facebook at Peer Review, Cultivating Creativity and Fulfillment in Academia. Thank you for listening.